So on behalf of the Russell Sage Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, and Duke University, it's my pleasure to welcome you back to the Summer Institute in Computational Social Science. So today we're talking about surveys, and now we are going to talk about the next part of what we can think about as the third era of survey research, and that's computer-administered interviews. So previously we talked about non-probability sampling and sort of who we end up talking to. And then now we're going to think much more about what we're going to learn from these people when we're actually talking to them. So the switch from human-administered interviews, which is what we're generally using now or have used in the past, to computer-administered interviews, I think this enables certain kinds of changes, and it also requires certain kinds of changes. So let's think a little bit about what this enables. So actually, let me just say one other thing about cost. So a lot of people say, oh, let's just switch to computer-administered interviews like online web surveys or robocalling surveys, and that will just save costs. And they just try to keep doing the same thing they were doing, but just at lower cost. And even though I said before cost is a really important consideration, let's also try to think about what are some new things that we can do now with a computer-administered interview that we couldn't do before with a human-administered interview. So these include things like breaking up a big survey that's usually answered outside of people's, like, if you think of a telephone survey, it's long and it's removed from the context of people's everyday lives. They stop what they're doing and answer your survey. You can imagine a survey instead where you cut up the question, you cut up the big instrument into little pieces, and then those pieces get sprinkled into the everyday lives of the people. So this is sometimes called experience sampling, where your phone will ring or buzz and you'll answer a survey question in the moment where that thing is actually happening. So that's an example of something that's really only possible if it's all automated. It would be very difficult for someone to call you at that moment and talk to you and get you to answer that question. That would be very, very expensive. But if it's automated, it's something that can be done much more cheaply. So let's think about the kinds of things that this enables. And let's also think about the kinds of things that are required. So generally, if people are doing these computer-administered interviews, I think there's likely to be lower levels of engagement and potentially lower levels of response. So filling out a web survey is potentially a very different experience than having someone sitting in your living room talking to you. And so I think if we don't make changes to make the data collection more engaging for respondents, we're going to have lots of problems. And more generally, I think social scientists are used to designing data collection for somewhat captive populations. So in these surveys, often, there's nothing that prevents you from hanging up the phone, but if you're talking to a person, there are norms against completely hanging up the phone. But if it's an online survey, there are no norms that prevent that person from just closing the browser. And in fact, that person is just one click away from the skateboarding dog. And so you have to realize that you're designing an instrument for a non-captive population. Similar with experiments. Any of you have designed lab experiments, psychology-style lab experiments. Those are really not generally very fun. And it is true that people can get up and leave those. But it's also true that they're unlikely to do that. And so if you're going to design an experiment online, you might have to deal with the fact that it should be enjoyable for people. So what if we could use computer-administered interviews to do things that weren't possible easily before? And what if we could potentially make the process of having people give us data more enjoyable? So the research that I'm going to talk to you about now is research that I've done with Karen Levy. And that project was really inspired by this website. So if you go to kitandwar.com, you will not hear another thing that I say today. You will definitely see two pictures of kittens You will be able to vote on whichever kitten you think is cuter. And then a new pair of kittens will come up. And then you can vote again and again and again. And before you know it, you spent 20 minutes clicking on kittens. So in addition to being a really enjoyable way to spend time, there's some other important stuff that's happening here. So if you look to see what are the winningest kittens, this is what you would see. These are pretty cute, I would say, in my professional opinion. If you click to see the losingest kittens, this is what you will see. So it's very different. Let's go back to the winningest kittens. So the other thing about these kittens that's really interesting to me is that all of these kittens were uploaded by users. And so if you think about the way, let's say a sociologist would normally try to find the picture of the cutest kitten in the world, we might go to the library and we might resort to theory and try to guess what we thought the cutest kitten might look like. Or we would go to the library and look at a bunch of books that have pictures of kittens, pick some that we thought looked cute, put them on a survey, and then see what people say. But even in the biggest university library, probably does not include the cutest kitten pictures in the world. Like, the cutest kitten pictures in the world are probably somewhere else. And it's not clear to me that we want to impose so much of our own ideas into the construction of the instrument. Like, what if we just don't have a good sense of what a cute kitten is? Or what if we're designing our survey for a country that we've never been to? So ideally, you wouldn't be doing research about a country you've never been to, but it has been known to happen. How are we sure that we're not baking in the wrong things? And so this is generally a problem that's well known about surveys, which is that they're generally not open to new information because you've written all the questions and all the answers. And more generally, there's this fundamental tension that underlies a lot of the way we collect data. We have some methods like surveys that are very good for quantification, but they are not open to new information. This is a known problem, and that's why we have other methods like interviews and participant observation and focus groups, which are much more open to new information, but those are slow and expensive and hard to quantify. And so what if we could try to come up with a hybrid new method that would combine the quantification you get from surveys with the openness that you get from interviews? And so that's what we tried to do, and we called them Wiki Surveys. So just like Wikipedia evolves over time based on user input, imagine if you had a survey that evolved over time based on user input. And this would potentially give you both quantification and openness. So another way of thinking about this is that Kitten War has solved a fundamental tension in social science research collection, and we're just going to build the Kitten War for social science. So before doing that, though, we thought, let's try to think about what general properties a wiki survey should satisfy. So like, let's not just like, let's think really about the properties that we want for this new instrument. And to do that, we thought a lot about traditional surveys. And then we also thought about websites that have a lot of user-generated content. And so if we took these user-generated content websites, the principles that help them work well, and the principles from survey research, and combine them, this is what we think these wiki surveys should be. So the first general principle that we came up with is greediness. And so let me explain a little bit more what I mean by that. So this is a cartoon schematic of the amount of information that's contributed to Wikipedia. So the x-axis here is the contributors sorted by rank, and the y-axis is the amount of information contributed. And so there are some people who contribute to Wikipedia 40 hours a week, or 80 hours a week, let's say. So these people, small number of people contribute a lot of information. And then there are also lots of people who contribute a small amount of information. Someone adds a comma occasionally, or adds a citation to a paper. And so one of the things that makes Wikipedia so successful is it's able to harvest this full range of effort. It's able to take the effort from these people who are sometimes called the fat head and it's also able to take the people from the long tail. And so Wikipedia is able to take as much as you are willing to give. Now, this is very different than traditional social science surveys and also experiments and other techniques that we use, where we take a fixed amount of information from each person. So if someone comes to you and says, I love your survey, I want to do it 100 times, first of all, we would probably say, are you okay? Like, because our surveys are so boring, no one would actually possibly want to do them. And then we would say, no, this is going to create all kinds of problems in my analysis. So we say, if you want to contribute a lot, sorry, you can only contribute this much. Likewise, if someone comes to you and says, you know what, I'll give you 2 minutes. You can have 2 minutes of my time for your survey. We would say, oh, no, sorry, can't do that. That's going to create something called item non-response, and that's going to cause problems for me. So we say, all these people, we don't want your information either. So by taking a fixed amount of information from each person, we're losing the fat head and we're losing the long tail. So to give you some sense of how much information is included in all of that, let's use Wikipedia again as an example. So if you allowed 10 and only 10 edits per person, they would lose about 90% of their edits. This is like a huge amount of information here and here. So we want to capture all that information. So we want to be greedy. The second principle is that we want to be collaborative. And so by that, we mean the respondents themselves should have a role in shaping the instrument, not just the researchers. Because again, there are a lot of things out there in the world that we don't know and we would like to learn. And so the best way to do that is to have the respondents help shape the instrument. And the third principle is that we should be adaptive. So by adaptive, I mean, if we cared about the respondents' time, then we would only want to ask them the questions that are the most important questions for us at that moment. If you think about the way a lot of surveys are designed, generally we write all the questions in a certain order, and then we, let's say, do 1,000 interviews. And by the time we've done 500 interviews, though, we know much more than we knew at the beginning. But we're not able to use that information to make the instrument more adaptive, right? We're not able to use the information we collect as we go on to be more and more efficient. So if you cared about the respondent's time, if you treated that as a valuable commodity, what you would want to do is say, I'm only going to ask you the most important question right now. And you, so we want our new instruments to be adaptive. So let me just briefly say that collaborative and adaptive seem similar, but they're different. Let me explain the difference. So collaborative is about being open to new information, and adaptive is about using the information we have more efficiently. Okay? So we said, let's try to create something that has these three properties. And so not just, so we got a grant from Google to build a system that has these three properties. And that's the website we have, allarideas.org. It's free and open source. Anyone in the world can go and create their own Wiki survey there that we host for them. And this provides a nice service for the world. And it also gives us a source of data and participants for us to do future research. So let me give you an example of what happens in one of these Wiki surveys. This is a project that we did with Mayor Bloomberg's office. It's no longer the mayor. So he wanted to, that New York City has a long-term sustainability plan in trying to make the city greener. It's called Plan YC 2030. And he wanted people to be able to participate and add new ideas to go into this plan. And so Mayor Bloomberg's office did a number of things. They hosted public meetings, there were city council hearings, and all kinds of other outreach to residents. And one of the things that they realized is that when they have these in-person outreach, they tend to attract a certain kind of person who is able to come and spend time participating in the government. And they realized there are lots of other people who maybe don't have time to go and show up at these city council hearings, but would also like to be able to participate. Another problem they had is imagine going to a community meeting of New Yorkers where they argue about the future of the city for 3 hours, and then summarizing all that information in a fair way. So pretty much everyone is going to feel like their view wasn't fully included appropriately in this report. So they wanted also a system where the process of aggregating that information would be more transparent as to how that happened, and the output would be easier to interpret. And so they, in addition to the other activities they did, they also created a Wiki Survey. And so what they did is they came up with a question. So which do you think is a better idea for creating a greener, greater New York? And then they seeded the Wiki Survey with 25 ideas that they had from previous outreach efforts. Things like require buildings to make energy upgrades and so on. So one of the things you'll notice is that all of these ideas are relatively short. This is not a place for your manifesto about the future of democracy or something. And that's intentional. So we limited all the ideas to be 140 characters. And that, again, is designed to make the data the process of participating a more enjoyable one. And so then our website creates our own Wiki survey for them, allorideas.org/planyc. And so you see this question, and you see 2 ideas here that were randomly chosen from the pool of ideas. A respondent can vote, and then 2 new ideas come up. They can vote again and again and again. And then at any time, anyone can click to view the results. Also, at any time, anyone can click this big button here to add their own idea, which then goes into the queue to be voted on by others. We have a question.
We have a question from the live stream. So Elliot from New York City wants to know how you filter junk inputs and questions, both poor quality questions or intentionally junk questions from bots intended to disrupt the survey.
It's a great question. So the short answer is we didn't do that. One of the things about the way the Wiki Survey platform is set up is that all of that moderation is done by the Wiki Survey creators, not by us. So that decision was made by the mayor's office. But I can tell you a little bit more about what went into their thinking, and I can tell you a little bit more about the general patterns that people use to try to deal with this. So obviously, I would not recommend including anything that is profane or factually inaccurate, extremely factually inaccurate, and so on. In terms of preventing, but this is a fine line because you don't really know what is a good idea or not. You think you know what people will be interested in, and so I generally encourage people not to screen out what they think are bad ideas because they don't really know if it's a bad idea. Another question that comes up is dealing with duplicates. I generally say I would include pretty much everything unless it's a word-for-word duplicate, because one of the things that we'll see later is that the same ideas expressed in slightly different ways can receive different levels of support. And so it is not for you to decide what is a duplicate. It is for the participants to decide what is the same. And so the philosophy here is in surveys, generally, we're very used to being constrained in what we can do. We're like, oh, we have to standardize this. We have to choose the right way of expressing this word. And like, let's just imagine a different setting. Like if you run ads on Google, have anyone ever tried to run search ads on Google? You don't try to pick like the one best ad because it's hard to know what's going to resonate with people who are searching. So you throw in like 100 variations of the same ad where you change each word slightly, you change the order, and then you see which one works best. And like if it turns out they all do the same, then you've learned that they're all the same. And oftentimes one will do better than the others, and that's because it's really hard to anticipate what's the same and what's different. And so what if we had surveys where we're much more willing to just have a bunch of things and let the people decide whether they're similar or different? So, yep.
I think that's a super nice idea, the Wiki Surveys. I'm currently thinking how bad persons could manipulate it. So we learned about web scraping, for example, you know. Let's say I don't like the idea about green in New York, and I would come up with a bot farm. Or would I even need a bot farm? Do you need users to log in?
Yes, okay. It's a good question.
Yeah, so that's the first thing. And then I basically can manipulate, right? I could pick answers that I like. I create accounts, or I do votes and votes and votes again. Maybe I set up several accounts so that you don't have one user which is like voting a lot of stuff. So how could you prevent this, or at least try to get an alarm thingy going?
Great. This is a great question. So let me talk. We do not have accounts, and I want to talk about why we don't have accounts. So we don't have accounts because we want to reduce the barriers to entry to participation. So if you look at other online participation systems, when we looked at them, and my sort of feeling from them, this is not based on research, this is based on feeling, is that the higher the barrier to entry, the more only people who have extreme views are going to go over that barrier to participate. And so the more complicated it is to do, the more you're sort of setting up extreme people to participate. So we wanted this to be as easy as possible so that everyone could participate. There are questions about manipulability, and I think around this time, there were other online systems where people can see a ranked list of ideas and vote for the one they want. So President Obama, for example, did use this Google moderator system. And the number one ideas in a bunch of topics were all related to legalization of marijuana. Because people just went and voted. A bunch of people said, hey, marijuana people, let's go and vote for these issues. There's a couple things that make manipulability harder than it initially appears. One is that you don't choose what you vote for. We choose the pair that you can see. So if someone uploaded like legalized marijuana, and you told all your friends to go and vote for marijuana, you would actually have to cast many other votes before that could show up. It is possible to do certain kinds of automated voting. I will say that certain forms of automated voting leave a very distinctive signature, and we have ways of looking for that, and we have ways of dealing with certain kinds of attacks. So the way that we think about making the site more resistant to these attacks is we see an attack, we develop a countermeasure, and then we deploy that countermeasure, and then the next attack has to be more complicated. And then we try to defend against that one, and then we do, and so there's definitely ways to defeat the defenses that we have. I'm 100% sure of that. I'm not going to announce them publicly. But this is a problem, actually, it's related to a lot of other online systems, that there's a desire for transparency. That is, you all, if you are going to be users of this platform, might want to know how are we preventing certain kinds of attacks. But on the other hand, if I tell you the safeguards we have in place, that makes them easier to overcome. And so I think this is a place where there's a tension between protection and transparency. That's a tension that arises in lots of real online systems as well. Questions? Yep.
I was wondering if you had thought about how to reconcile the collaborative principle with potential demand effects. So basically, to collaborate, you need to know what the purpose of the survey is. Have you thought about how to reconcile those?
Yeah, so there's a question about how, there's a more general question also about how you communicate what's happening to the users. Because this is also not like a survey that people are used to. And so as I've worked with many groups and users, I realize how much we are trained to understand what a survey is. People are like, oh, a survey, I know what that is. It has an end. This has no end. You can keep voting as long as you want. So people are like, how do you have a survey without an end? This is very unfortunate. I've gotten some emails from people who are like, when is it end? I want to stop. So it's a challenge that we've had to communicate to people, the users, what to expect. And it's also a challenge that the Wiki Survey creators choose with the types of ideas they have to make it clear to the users what is sort of in scope and out of scope. So even though it's open to new information, the seed ideas help set a context for what the other ideas that will eventually get uploaded are. Okay, I'm going to keep going, and we can have a lunch discussion table about Wiki Surveys if we want. Or no, maybe tomorrow. We'll have plenty of time to talk more about Wiki Surveys. I want to show you the results, and I want to stay on schedule because we want to start talking about linking surveys and big data. So what exactly are we trying to estimate? So generally, as I said before, it's important to know what you're trying to estimate. So this is the data structure that we have here. There are votes that are nested within sessions. So there are no accounts, but we can have a sense of what a session is. And roughly, A session is like an individual person participating at a single time on a single device. Then we can see the pair, and we can see the thing that the person voted for. What we want to estimate is what we're calling an opinion matrix. So for each session, for each idea, we'd like to know how much the person in that session liked that idea. And if we knew this full opinion matrix, then we could do lots of stuff with it. Now, so the New York City, they launched this. They recruited a bunch of people using non-probability sampling methods, like sending out a bunch of things on Twitter. I realized this is not a probability sample of people who live in New York. There is nothing, though, that would prevent you from taking a probability sample and then putting a wiki survey on top of it. So again, emphasizing the modularity between the sampling process and the interviewing process. These two things are separate. In this case, though, it was not a probability sample. So this is what we found. So this is the number of responses per session. So there was one session that had about 800 responses. So we saw these people, a small number of people contributed a lot of responses. A large number contributed a small number of responses. So this is just like the Wikipedia graph, except this is real. This is real data. Also with the uploaded ideas, similar thing. A small number of people uploaded many ideas. A large number of people uploaded a small number of ideas. So we designed a system to have this property, and it actually had that property. Here are the results. So the score is the estimated probability that this idea would beat a randomly chosen other idea for a randomly chosen session. So it's a summary of that bigger opinion matrix. And the score goes from 0 to 100. Higher score is better. All of the ideas that are in blue were uploaded by users. So 8 of the top 10 ideas were uploaded by users. I want to talk briefly about what kinds of things were uploaded by users that scored well. And I'm over time, so I'm going to go a little bit faster. But the beauty is that we have a whole paper about this where we explain everything in great detail. Alternative framings, where people take an idea that is already known, but they express it in a different way. So this was keep NYC's drinking water clean by banning fracking in NYC's watershed. So we asked the mayor's office, don't you know about water quality? And they're like, of course we know about water quality. And we were like, well, why wasn't that in any of your seed ideas? And they're like, well, because this person talks about fracking and connecting that to water, and we didn't think about it like that. But when you add the word fracking, it becomes something that people are very engaged with. So it's not a new idea, but it's a new framing of an existing idea, which can be very valuable. And so survey researchers sometimes think of these as bugs. It's like people are more likely to support aid for the poor than they are to support welfare. That's a bug. Why aren't people more consistent in their beliefs? I think that's actually a feature, right? That is telling us something about the world that's important. The second thing was actually novel information. So these were things that the mayor's office was not aware of, at least the part that we were working with. So plug ships into the electrical grid so they don't idle in port, reducing emissions equivalent to 12,000 cars per ship. So this was not something they had thought of before, and it's something that eventually ended up in the plan, a version of this idea. So that's a little bit about wiki surveys. I want to talk a little bit. This graph shows why I will bet you a beer or a coffee or whatever you like to drink, that if you do a wiki survey, the best scoring ideas will be uploaded by users. I think it's a simple mathematical fact, and it's described more in the paper. I want to talk more about this as a sort of way of doing research. So I think a lot of times research is very hard. You have to like work really hard to do a paper, and then you have to start again and work on the next paper. And like, wouldn't it be great though if it got easier and easier? So the idea is that we can create this kind of like virtuous cycle where we have this website that brings in more users. More users enables us to do more research. More research enables us to have a better website, and so on. And so then things get easier and easier. I will say in practice, this is very hard. Yeah, so we can talk more about that offline. So we're currently hosting about 12,000 wiki surveys with about 18 million votes. We've had users from governments, so the House of Representatives in Brazil and the UN. We've had different social movements participate. Different companies have used it as well. But I want to say one thing about, we've talked a lot about access to data a little bit. How can we partner with companies to get data? I also want to say, you can also just create your own data, right? You don't need to partner with companies. And if you think about the amount of time it takes to partner with companies, and you think about the amount of sacrifices that may be involved, and if you think about the amount of time that fails, if you took all that time and energy and invested it into creating something on your own, you might be able to do something like this. We are, I think, out of time for questions. So we're going to go on to the next chunk. We are way out of time. So we're going to go to the next chunk. And then the reason why we're going to not have questions, though, is because we want to have a lot of time for you to do this yourself. But if anyone has any questions for me about the Wiki Surveys, the statistical models, or the process of doing it, or what it was like to try to create your own system, I'm happy to talk much more about that. OK.